A city so corrupt, its cries reached heaven, a night when fire rained from the sky. In a single breath, 2 mighty cities were erased from the earth. Their wealth, their walls, their laughter, their pride, all turned to silence. But this story is more than destruction. It is a warning, a mirror held up to every generation, including ours. Tonight, you will step into the streets of Sodom. You will hear the cries, you will see the flames, and you will face the question that Abraham himself asked. Would God destroy the righteous with the wicked, or is mercy stronger than fire? The story of Sodom and Gomorrah does not begin with fire. It begins with beauty. The Jordan Valley stretched out like a jewel in the desert. From the high ridges you could see it glimmer under the morning sun. Rivers winding like silver threads, green fields spreading like carpets, orchards heavy with fruit, vineyards rolling across the hillsides. Sheep and cattle grazed freely, their bells ringing faintly in the air. Travellers who passed through would say, "Surely this is like the very garden of the Lord." It was into this valley that Lot, the nephew of Abraham, first set his eyes. He and Abraham had journeyed far together, leaving behind their homeland to follow the call of God. Their herds had grown so vast that the land between them could no longer hold them both. Quarrels broke out between their herdsmen. Abraham, gentle and wise, said, "Let there be no strife between you and me, for we are family. If you go to the left, I will go to the right. If you go to the right, I will go to the left." Lot looked. He lifted his eyes and saw the valley, green, watered, alive. To him it was destiny, prosperity, promise. Without hesitation, he chose it, and nestled in that valley, glittering like crowns upon fertile plains, were the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. From a distance they dazzled. Their walls caught the sun and shone like stone forged in fire. Their gates teemed with merchants, their marketplaces overflowing with colour. Fabrics from Egypt, spices from the east, gold and silver stacked in scales. Music filled the squares. Children played in the streets. Torches at night lit the houses in a glow of laughter and wine. It was the image of prosperity. To the eye, it seemed untouchable. To Lot, it seemed like the perfect place to plant his life. But prosperity has a way of hiding corruption. Behind the gates, beyond the markets, something darker grew. Wealth had given birth to arrogance. Abundance had rotted into indulgence. The poor were mocked, the hungry ignored, the stranger at the gate humiliated. Men boasted of their cruelty, and women paraded desire without shame. Violence was no longer feared, it was celebrated. Children grew up learning that power and pleasure were the only gods worth serving. The valley that looked like Eden was becoming a stage for hell. The cries rose. They rose from the mouths of the beaten, the violated, the forgotten. They rose from the widows and the fatherless, from the traveller robbed and left in the street, from the child with no bread, from the oppressed who had no judge to hear their case. These cries pierced the heavens, and God, who hears what men ignore, listened. "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great," he said. "Their sin is very grave. I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the cry that has reached me." Judgment had not yet fallen, but the hourglass had turned. Lot, for his part, settled near the city, pitching his tent toward Sodom. Perhaps he thought he could live in its shadow without being touched by its corruption. Perhaps he believed that prosperity was worth the risk. Perhaps he told himself he would remain righteous, though surrounded by wickedness. But Sodom is not a city one merely lives beside. It seeps into a man's home. It whispers into his choices. Slowly it claims the hearts of those who think they can resist. And high above in the hills of Mamre, Abraham watched the valley from a distance. His tent stood beneath the oak trees. His altar of stone bore the marks of sacrifice. His flocks grazed on the ridges. He lived not in splendor, but in trust, not in walls, but in the wide open land of faith. From his place he could see the smoke of Sodom's feasts rising in the evenings, the glitter of its lights shimmering like false stars. To Abraham, those cities were not a promise, but a burden, for in them lived his nephew Lot, his blood, his kin. And though Abraham did not yet know what was coming, he felt in his spirit the weight of a valley running out of time. The story of Sodom begins here, in the contrast between the valley's beauty and its corruption, between the promise of Eden and the shadow of judgment, between a man who chose prosperity and a man who chose God. The fire had not yet fallen. The sky was still blue. The markets still bustled. Children still laughed, but the cries of the oppressed were louder than the music, louder than the laughter, louder than the pride of men who thought themselves gods. And the judge of all the earth had heard them. The valley gleamed like Eden, but inside its cities the hearts of men had turned to stone. At first glance, Sodom seemed alive with prosperity. Its gates welcomed merchants. Its markets overflowed with silver, wool, spices, and wine. Banquets stretched into the night, songs filled the air, dancers whirled under torchlight. But listen closely, not to the music but to the silence beneath it. That silence was filled with suffering. Behind the high walls, arrogance ruled. The wealthy flaunted their riches while the poor starved at their gates. A widow begging for bread was mocked. A stranger seeking rest was humiliated. Justice was twisted. Bribes were taken in courts. The strong crushed the weak. The innocent were forgotten. The prophets would later describe their sins with chilling clarity. Ezekiel would write, "Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but they did not aid the poor and needy. They were haughty and did abominations before me. So I removed them when I saw it: pride, arrogance, self-indulgence, neglect of the broken, violence without shame. The people of Sodom lived as though tomorrow would always come, as though judgment were a fairy tale to frighten children. They drank, they laughed, they bought and sold, they married and built. They believed nothing could shake their walls, nothing could silence their songs. But there were voices the city could not drown, the cries of the oppressed, the cries of the hungry, the cries of the abused. Every voice silenced in the streets was heard in heaven. Every act of cruelty carried a weight that climbed like smoke. The outcry was relentless. It pierced the heavens and reached the throne of God. And God, who is patient but not blind, answered. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is very great. Their sin is very grave. I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the cry that has reached me. Picture the contrast. Men feasting in courtyards, raising cups to their lips, while in the heavens the judge of all the earth was rising to investigate their end. The very night they thought secure was the night their judgment approached. The tragedy of Sodom was not ignorance. They had plenty, yet refused to share. They had strength, yet used it for cruelty. They had time, yet spent it chasing lust and mocking righteousness. When Lot would later plead with his sons-in-law to flee, they would laugh in his face. Such was the heart of a people so hardened that even mercy sounded like a joke. The sin of Sodom was not hidden in shadows. It was flaunted in the streets, celebrated as freedom, paraded as pride. What once would have brought shame now brought applause. And when corruption becomes a source of laughter, judgment is never far away. Still God is merciful, still he waits. He does not strike in haste. He looks, he listens, he warns. He searches for the righteous who might yet turn the tide. That is his way. He delays his hand even when men mock him, because his heart is mercy. But when the outcry becomes unbearable, when victims' voices fill heaven, when violence and arrogance leave no room for repentance, the day of mercy ends. And so the angels descended. 2 messengers of judgment began their journey toward Sodom, while one remained behind to speak with Abraham. The contrast could not have been sharper, the valley glittering with wealth and the cries of its victims filling the sky. Sodom thought itself untouchable, but the heavens had already declared its case open. The sentence had not yet fallen, but the hourglass of its days had run low. Soon the streets that mocked strangers would be blind. Soon the laughter at injustice would turn to screams. Soon the valley that looked like Eden would burn like a furnace. But not yet. For one man, Abraham, still stood in the hills, and his voice would rise to ask what no one else dared to ask. Could mercy still triumph over fire? While Sodom laughed in the valley, Abraham lived in the quiet hills. His tent was pitched at Mamre, beneath the shade of great oaks that stood like sentinels over the land. Here the air was clear, the soil dry but alive with pasture, the horizon wide and open. Abraham had no walls, no palace, no marketplace filled with silver and gold. His wealth was flocks and herds, tents and servants, and most of all, a promise. For years he had walked with the God who called him out of his father's land. He had built altars of stone on lonely ridges. He had trusted the unseen, waiting for a son who was promised, yet delayed. His life was not without trial nor without sorrow, but it was marked by a simple truth. Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. From his hills he could see the valley below. On clear days when the sun burned high, the haze of Sodom and Gomorrah shimmered on the horizon. By night their torches glittered like false stars. Abraham knew the cities were rich. He knew his nephew Lot had chosen them for their promise. But Abraham also knew that wealth without righteousness was a fragile crown. He could not look at the valley without feeling both the weight of beauty and the shadow of judgment. It was noon, the hottest part of the day. The earth shimmered, heat pressed down like a heavy cloak. Abraham sat at the entrance of his tent, the air thick and still when he lifted his eyes. 3 men stood before him. They appeared suddenly without the sound of steps, without the dust of a journey. Travelers, yes, but something about them bent the very air around them. Abraham rose at once and bowed low, his face near the ground. "My Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Let water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree, while I bring bread that you may refresh yourselves." He hurried into the tent. "Sarah, quickly, 3 measures of fine flour, knead it and bake bread." He ran to the herd, chose a tender calf, and gave it to a servant who prepared it quickly. He took curds and milk and set it before them, and he stood by while they ate, a host watching guests with honor and fear. Hospitality was sacred in Abraham's world. To welcome the stranger was to welcome God himself. And here the truth was more literal than he could have imagined. For these were no ordinary travelers. 2 were messengers, angels sent with a mission, and the 3rd was greater. Abraham's spirit trembled, for in the voice of this man was the weight of the Lord himself. They spoke first of Sarah and of the promise. "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son." Sarah laughed in the tent, for she was old, long past the age of childbearing. But the Lord said, "Why did Sarah laugh? Is anything too hard for the Lord?" And in that moment Abraham knew again the voice of the one he served, the God who speaks promises into impossibility. But soon the conversation shifted. The meal was over. The men rose and looked down toward Sodom. Abraham's heart tightened. Why would heavenly messengers walk toward that city of pride? He walked with them a little, and the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I have chosen him, that he may command his children to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice." Then came the revelation that chilled the air. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great. Their sin is very grave. I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. The words fell like thunder, though spoken quietly. Abraham felt them sink into his bones. The cities of the valley, those walls he had watched gleam in the distance, those lights that glittered at night, were under judgment. Their cries had reached the throne of heaven. Their sins had filled the measure. And now the Lord himself would verify the charge. In that instant, Abraham's thoughts raced. His nephew Lot lived there, his wife, his daughters, his household, all within those walls. And beyond Lot, what if there were others? Families who had not bowed to the city's corruption, children who had not yet learned its pride. Could they be swept away together with the wicked? Would mercy vanish with the fire? Abraham's heart broke in silence. Few men would dare speak against such a decree, but Abraham knew the character of the God he served. He is just, he is merciful. Could it be that justice itself would spare the guilty for the sake of the innocent? Could it be that mercy might hold back fire if only a handful of righteous remained? The messengers turned toward the valley, but Abraham stood still. His lips trembled, his courage wavered, and then, with reverent fear, he spoke, "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" It was not a question born of defiance, but of desperate love. It was the plea of a man who could not bear to see innocent blood swept away with guilt. It was the voice of intercession rising from the hills, while the valley below laughed in arrogance. The Lord listened, and he would answer. The two angels turned and began walking toward Sodom. Dust rose at their heels as the path bent downward into the valley. But Abraham remained standing before the Lord. His heart pounded, his mind raced. The revelation had struck him like a thunderclap. Sodom and Gomorrah, the proud cities glittering in the distance, were ripe for destruction. Their sins had reached heaven. Their cries had summoned judgment. Yet within those walls lived his own blood. Lot, his nephew, his brother's son, Lot's wife, Lot's daughters. Would they be consumed along with the guilty? Would fire fall upon them, all without distinction? Abraham could not remain silent. And so, trembling, he stepped forward. "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" His voice cracked in the dry air. "Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep it away and not spare it for the sake of the 50 righteous who are in it?" He paused, but the silence was not empty. The Lord's presence burned like the sun at noon, patient and steady. Abraham pressed further, his words bold but reverent. "Far be it from you to do such a thing, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just?" And the Lord answered, "If I find 50 righteous in Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake." The words fell like water on parched ground. Abraham exhaled, yet his spirit was not at rest. For he knew Sodom, he knew its pride, its cruelty, its corruption. Would 50 righteous souls truly be found there? He feared not, and so, with a humility that pressed his face low, he spoke again. "Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord, I who am but dust and ashes. Suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? The Lord replied, "I will not destroy it if I find 45 there." Abraham's courage grew. The fire of compassion for the innocent fueled his words. "Suppose 40 are found there." The Lord said, "For the sake of 40, I will not do it." Abraham's lips trembled, but he pressed on. "Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Suppose 30 are found there." The Lord answered, "I will not destroy it if I find 30 there." Still, Abraham's heart whispered, 30 may not be found. He had walked near those cities, seen their arrogance. He bowed lower. "Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord." "Suppose 20 are found there." The Lord replied, "For the sake of 20, I will not destroy it." And now Abraham's voice was a whisper, fragile yet unyielding. He had descended from 50 to 45, from 40 to 30, from 30 to 20. He dared one final plea, "Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak again but this once. Suppose 10 are found there." The Lord said, "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it." 10. Out of thousands in the city, 10 would be enough. 10 righteous souls would hold back fire from heaven. 10 lives of justice could spare a valley of arrogance. Abraham's heart rested, though uneasily, for he knew mercy had been offered in its fullest measure. If even 10 righteous lived within those walls, the city would stand. But if not, judgment would come. The Lord departed, and Abraham returned to his tent. The angels pressed on toward Sodom, and in the silence of the hills, Abraham's mind turned over the numbers like stones in his hand. 50, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. The mercy of God was vast. The patience of God was long. But what if the city held not even 10 who feared him? The valley shimmered still in the sun, its laughter rising, its markets busy, its pride untouched. But heaven had drawn a line, and the question now hung in the air: were there 10 righteous in Sodom, or had the city surrendered itself completely to corruption? Evening settled over the valley. The sun bled into the horizon, painting the sky in fire, then fading into shadow. The walls of Sodom glowed in the last light. Torches flickered at the gates, and the city's heartbeat quickened. For while other towns grew quiet at dusk, Sodom came alive, its streets filled with revelry. Merchants tallied their profits, musicians struck their strings, dancers twirled in the squares. The smell of roasted meat mingled with the sharpness of wine. But beneath the laughter ran an undercurrent of hunger, not the hunger for bread, but for power, for indulgence, for whatever the heart demanded without restraint. Into this city 2 figures walked. They bore the dust of travel, their faces set with quiet purpose. To the eyes of men, they looked like strangers passing through. To heaven, they were angels descending with judgment. At the gate of Sodom sat Lot. He had once pitched his tent outside the city, but now he dwelt within its walls, seated among its elders. When he saw the men approach, something stirred in him, urgency, almost fear. He rose quickly and bowed low. "My lords, turn aside, I beg you, into your servant's house. Spend the night, wash your feet, then you may rise early and go your way." But they replied, "No, we will spend the night in the square." The words chilled Lot. He knew the city too well. He had seen what happened to strangers after dark. His voice grew sharper, almost pleading. "Please, I urge you strongly, do not remain in the open." He pressed them again and again until at last they consented. He led them through winding streets to his house. Shadows leaned from doorways, laughter echoed in courtyards, eyes watched from corners. Lot moved quickly, drawing the strangers inside, shutting the door behind them. He prepared a meal, simple bread, baked without leaven, and a few provisions. They ate in quiet, and for a moment the house felt like a refuge, a small island of honor in a sea of corruption. but Sodom has a way of finding what it wants. Before they lay down, the sound began outside. At first, a few voices, rough laughter carried through the night air, then more footsteps, more shouting, the street outside filled with men, young and old, drawn as if by one appetite. The crowd swelled until it pressed against Lot's door, their voices thundering against the walls. "Where are the men who came to you tonight?" they shouted. "Bring them out to us, that we may use them." The demand was not hospitality, but humiliation. They sought to strip the strangers of honor, to turn them into a spectacle of violence. It was cruelty disguised as desire, power clothed in mockery. Lot's heart pounded. He stepped outside and pulled the door behind him, shutting it tight. He faced the mob alone, his voice trembling but desperate. "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly." The crowd jeered. "Stand aside, outsider. Who are you to judge us? You came here as a guest, and now you act as a ruler." Lot pleaded, desperation twisting his words into compromise. "Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you. Do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." The offer was unthinkable, a father's horror born of fear. Yet such was the darkness of the city that even this plea did not move them. Instead, rage erupted. "This man came to sojourn, and he dares to judge us. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." The mob surged forward. Hands reached, voices roared. The door trembled under their assault. Lot pressed against it, his body a fragile barrier against the fury of the streets. And then, suddenly, hands from within reached out. The strangers pulled Lot back inside and shut the door. In an instant, a blinding light flashed, unseen to those within, but felt by the mob outside. Blindness struck them. The men stumbled, clawing at the walls, shouting in confusion. They groped for the door they had just seen, for the handle they had just grasped, but their eyes saw nothing. They cursed, they cried out, they staggered in circles. The street dissolved into chaos as they grasped for an entrance that had vanished from their sight. Inside the house, the angels revealed themselves. Their voices carried the gravity of heaven. "Do you have anyone else here? Sons-in-law, sons, daughters, anyone you have in this city, bring them out of this place, for we are about to destroy it. The outcry against its people has become great before the Lord, and He has sent us to destroy it." The words fell heavy, final. The laughter outside had turned to cries of confusion. But within the walls of Lot's house, the greater storm was about to break. Lot looked at his daughters, at his wife, at the angels whose presence filled the room. His heart pounded with fear and urgency. He thought of his sons-in-law pledged to marry his daughters, still within the city, still mocking, still blind to what was coming. He rose to his feet. He had to warn them. Lot stepped into the night by a narrow passage, keeping to the deeper shadows where the torchlight did not reach. The city rang with confusion. Men stumbled in the street, still grasping for a door they could not find, cursing the dark as if the dark were to blame. Windows opened, faces leaned out, questions flew and vanished like sparks. Somewhere, a song tried to rise again, defiant, but broke against the wall of shouts. Lot moved fast. He knew every turn between his house and the homes of the men pledged to marry his daughters. He had walked these ways in better days, when he told himself that Sodom's corruptions could be held at arm's length, that a righteous man could live here untouched. But tonight, the streets felt different, thinner, as if a skin were stretched over a wound. He reached the first house and pounded once, twice. A servant pulled the door. "Your master," Lot said, breathless. "I must speak to him now." The young man came laughing, cup still in hand, smile already formed for a jest that died when he saw Lot's face. "What is it?" "The Lord will destroy this city," Lot said. "Up, get out of this place. Take what you can carry and go. Tonight." The smile returned, but with pity rather than joy. "Father," he said, as if soothing a frightened child, "the night has gone badly for you. Come in, sit. We will pour you a better drink than the one you had." Lot shook his head. "Listen to me. I saw what happened at my door. The men outside he swallowed. They were struck blind. Do you hear me? They clawed at the walls like men in a cave. Angels are in my house. Messengers. Judgment is coming with the dawn." The young man's eyes flickered, then hardened into amusement. "Blind, drunk, more like. Angels? Father, you have lived too long among tents. City talk offends you. You call judgment what any man would call a rough night." He clapped Lot's shoulder. "Sleep. Morning will look like morning." As it always has, Lot left him and ran to the second house. There the same scene replayed. A grin, a frown, the tilt of a cup, the gesture toward a bench. "Up," Lot pleaded, "up now. This night is your last chance." They laughed at him, kinder than a mob, but crueler than fire, because laughter at such an hour is worse than a blow. He returned to the alley sick with helplessness. The air tasted of smoke, though no flames yet burned. He pressed his back to a wall and closed his eyes. He pictured his daughters at the hearth, his wife's hands tightening around the small bundle of what she could not leave. The two strangers whose calm had more weight than any army. And beneath those images he felt the pull of Sodom, the soft tug of convenience, the whisper that had followed him for years. Not tonight, not yet, not so fast. He opened his eyes and moved. There was still time to gather what mattered, the living. Everything else could burn. By the time he reached his house, the night had deepened and quieted, as if the city had grown tired of its own noise. Inside, his wife looked at him with a question she had asked a dozen times already. He answered with the only words left. "We leave." His daughters stood ready, cloaks over their shoulders, hair bound, eyes wide as open doors. "You're betrothed?" one asked. "They will not come," Lot said. "I told them the truth, and they laughed." His wife looked past him to the shelf where vessels waited, to the chest beneath the bed, to the woven blanket that had been her mother's. "A moment," she said, and took a step. "No," Lot answered. "There are no more moments." The two men were standing as if they had foreseen the exact instant they would be needed. Their faces did not show haste, only a kind of grave certainty that set the room in order. "Up," one said. "Take your wife, take your daughters. Whatever is here must be left." "We will go now," Lot nodded, and then he did what he had not had the strength to do all night. He obeyed without bargaining. He took his wife's hand, pressed the other to the shoulder of one daughter, then the next. The angels opened the door. Outside, Sodom pretended to sleep. A dog barked once, then feared its own voice and went silent. Far off, a pair of men argued softly as if even their quarrel had grown tired. Somewhere a flute tried a few notes and stopped. The night held its breath. They crossed the threshold and stepped into a darkness that felt as thin as paper. One angel walked ahead, the other behind. Lot did not ask their names. He did not ask the route. When a finger pointed, he followed. When a palm lifted, he stood. At the edge of the district, the angel turned and spoke words that burned more fiercely than any flame that would fall. "Escape for your life. Do not look back. Do not stop anywhere in the plain. Escape to the hills." Lot swallowed. The hills were far, and his family was not strong. "My lords," he said, and the title was no politeness now, but confession of what stood before him. "Behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot reach the hills. I fear the disaster will overtake me on the way, and I will die. See, There is a little city near enough to flee to, and it is small. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? Then my life will be saved." The angel regarded him a long moment, and Lot felt mercy like a hand steadying a man on a narrow ledge. "Behold, I grant you this favor," the angel said. "I will not overthrow the city of which you speak. Hurry, escape there. I can do nothing until you arrive." So the little place was called Zoar, and mercy drew a circle around it. They moved again, faster now, with the certainty of men who have chosen and cannot unchoose. The plain opened wide. Sodom's walls were behind them, though its breath still warmed the night. Lot did not look. He set his eyes on a darkness that would lighten soon into dawn. His daughters kept pace at his sides, small shapes wrapped in wool, their steps surprisingly sure. His wife lagged. It was not rebellion, not at first. It was the natural weight of memory. Each stride pulled something from her. The colour of a wall at evening, the slant of light across a floor, the voice of a neighbour calling through the window as bread cooled on a cloth. She had raised her children in those streets. She had bought oil at that market, measured grain on those scales, laughed in those courtyards. Sodom had not been only sin to her, it had been home. The command lived in her mind, do not look back, but the heart often keeps its own commandments. She quickened her steps, then slowed, then quickened again, balanced between obedience and longing, like a bird between two winds. She pressed her bundle tighter, as if weight could anchor her against the pull of memory. The path bent toward a low rise. Beyond it, the road fell away toward the little town that mercy had spared. The eastern sky just barely paled, a line as thin as a blade. The angel turned and lifted his hand once more. "Hurry," he said. "The day will not wait." They topped the rise. Zoar lay still and small ahead, a handful of roofs cupped in the palm of the hills. One more field, one more slope, one more measure of breath, and they would be inside its little circle of safety. Lot reached for the last reserve in his chest and found it. Behind them, the air changed. Lot felt it first in his skin, a prickle as if the night itself had found teeth. Then in his ears, a hum that grew into a pressure, then into a distant roar. The plain, which had seemed simply wide, now seemed hollow, as if it had been waiting to speak. "Do not look," the angel said again, and the words were not instruction now, but shelter. Lot did not look. One daughter reached for his arm. He squeezed her hand without turning. The other stumbled. He caught her and pushed her forward. They ran the last stretch like men who know the ground. Behind them has begun to fall away. His wife stopped. Perhaps it was the change in the air, the first metallic scent of something the world had not breathed since its birth. Perhaps it was the sudden silence between one breath and the next, a gap into which a lifetime of rooms and faces rushed all at once. Perhaps it was the thought, simple and sharp as a thorn, that she had left too quickly and needed only a heartbeat to confirm what she already knew. That morning would make a mockery of all this fear, that Sodom would endure, that a woman is not asked to break her life in two without looking once over her shoulder at the half she leaves behind. She turned. Lot did not see it. He felt the absence like a rope cut clean. He did not stop. The angels did not stop. The daughters did not stop. They crossed the invisible threshold of Zoar, and the angel lowered his hand as one lowers a lid. Dawn cracked open. From the heavens came a rain no man had ever seen. It did not fall like water, light and forgiving. It fell heavy, bright, roaring. Sulphur and fire poured out as if the sky had become a furnace door, swung wide. The sound struck before the light, a concussion that hammered the plain, then a roar that swallowed every other voice. The earth leapt underfoot. The valley where orchards had stood heaved like an animal under the lash. House after house, street after street, the cities burst into flame as if seed long sown had finally sprouted. Lot gathered his daughters into the shadow of a wall and pressed their heads to his chest. He did not lift his eyes. The heat reached him anyway, a breath like the heart of a kiln. Wind drove ash past the mouth of the little town, and with it scraps of sound, one long wail torn suddenly short, the crack of beams, the hiss of boiling water. The valley that had been called a garden became a crucible. Above the noise another sound arose, deeper, almost wordless, the voice of everything that had been wrong, crying out one final time as it burned. It was not a sound a man can describe. It was a sound a man remembers in his bones. Lot's mind searched for his wife and found only the path where her hand had slipped from his. He knew better than to turn. He set his teeth and spoke to his daughters words that were less speech than stubbornness. "We are alive," he said, again and again, because he could not say what else had been lost. When the first fury had spent itself, the roar diminished to a long grinding like a tide turned to stone. Ash swirled in eddies along the road. The sky, which should have been new with morning, went black, then bruised, then a reddish-brown that made noon look like dusk. Smoke climbed from the plain in pillars so thick a man could imagine they held up the sky itself. Only then did the angel speak. "Stay," he said, "do not leave this little city until the day has decided what remains of the world." Lot nodded. He had no strength to move. The daughters leaned into him, small weights that kept him from blowing away like dust. In the hollow of that small town, mercy made a chamber. It was not comfort, it was not ease, it was the difference between breath and none. Lot did not count the minutes. He counted the living, 1, 2, 3. He did not count the dead. That number belonged to God. When at last the shock loosened its grip, he asked the question he had been avoiding, the one that would cut him worse than any falling stone. "Where is—" he did not finish. The nearest angel answered what had not been asked. She looked back. Lot closed his eyes. A picture formed unbidden, not a face twisting in fear, not a body running from fire, but a woman pausing under a sky that had not yet broken, turning toward a city she could not stop calling home. He saw her as salt, not in whiteness or shape, but in meaning, the distillation of longing, the crystal of a choice. He did not weep then. The body stores its tears where strength can reach them later. He drew a breath that felt like a vow instead. He did not know what it contained, only that it would carry them one step beyond this day. The fire still fell, though less now, and the smoke still rose. In a little while, Abraham would stand on the ridge where he had once argued mercy against judgment and see only the pillars of smoke. In a little while, the names of the cities would become a proverb. But for this moment, in a circle as small as 3 beating hearts, warning had done its work. The righteous were few. Mercy had seized them by the hand and dragged them out, and what could not be carried had been left behind to burn. Lot lifted his head. "We will not go back," he said, not because anyone had suggested it, but because the sentence needed to be spoken aloud to seal the choice. The daughters nodded, their faces set the way faces set when girls decide to live because their father has decided to live. Outside the wall the valley burned. Inside, 3 people sat very still and let the warning finish its last syllable. They had escaped. And morning, though disfigured by smoke, was still morning. They hurried across the plain, 4 shadows moving against the pale line of dawn. Lot's hand clutched his daughters, his wife close behind, the angels urging them forward. Their feet slipped on stones, cloaks whipped in the wind, breath burned in their throats. The words of the messengers thundered in their ears, "Do not look back. Do not stop anywhere in the plain. Escape for your life." Every step was obedience, every stride an act of faith. To look back was to break trust, to doubt mercy, to long for what God had already condemned. Yet obedience is heavy when memory calls. Lot's daughters pressed on, their eyes fixed on Zoar ahead. Small and insignificant, the town lay like a speck against the hills. To them it was hope, though fear chased them like wolves. They dared not glance behind. They dared not think of the screams now rising in the distance. Lot pressed forward too, though grief gnawed his chest. He thought of his sons-in-law, the young men who had laughed in his face only hours before. He thought of neighbors whose voices he would never hear again. He thought of the city he had once chosen, because it glittered with promise. Each step forward felt like leaving behind 1,000 fragments of himself, scattered among the streets of Sodom. But his wife, her steps faltered. The city was still in her heart. Every stone, every vessel, every song sung in the courtyards, every face she had known. She had borne children in those streets. She had laughed with friends, woven cloth with her hands, bought oil in the market, shared bread with neighbors. Sodom was not just corruption to her, it was home. The command, "Do not look back," echoed in her mind. But commands wrestle with longing, and longing often wins. Her pace slowed. She lagged behind, her eyes flicking sideways. The smoke rising on the horizon pulled at her like a magnet. The memory of comfort whispered louder than the warning of judgment. One glance, she thought, one look, to say farewell, and she turned. In an instant her body stiffened. Her breath caught. The warmth drained from her flesh. The motion of life froze where it stood. She became a pillar, her form crystallized, hardened, transformed into salt. One moment she was wife, mother, companion. The next she was monument, a silent witness to disobedience, a frozen echo of longing for what God had left behind. Lot did not see it. He could not. He pressed forward, gripping his daughters, eyes fixed on Zoar. Yet something in him knew. A weight vanished at his side, a presence he had not thought could fail. The rope of his family line snapped, leaving only 3 where 4 had run. The daughters felt it too. They stumbled, then pressed harder into their father's hands. None spoke. Silence held them, the silence of loss too sharp for words. Behind them, the valley roared. Flames devoured houses. Walls fell like sand. The air split with thunder. Sodom burned, but Lot's wife remained, not as survivor, not as victim, but as symbol, a monument of longing, a warning carved in stone and salt. The plain carried her story for centuries. Travelers would later whisper of a figure standing still, frozen in white, looking forever toward the ruins. The prophets would speak of her without naming her, a warning of what happens when the heart clings to sin even as the body flees from it. And Jesus himself would say to his disciples, "Remember Lot's wife. Her death was not by fire, nor by sword, nor by famine. It was by a single glance backward. A look that revealed her heart was still in Sodom. She did not perish because she left too late, but because she could not let go." Lot reached Zoar with his daughters. His chest heaved, his eyes blurred. He did not turn his head, but he knew. He knew one face was missing. He knew mercy had saved 3, but not 4. He knew the price of hesitation, and he would remember it until his last breath. The story of Lot's wife is short, only a single verse in Scripture, but Lot's wife looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Yet in those few words lies a tragedy that speaks louder than volumes. It tells us that judgment is not only about cities and nations, it is also about hearts, about what we cling to, about what we cannot release. Lot's wife looked back, and in that look she revealed where her treasure truly lay. Ahead was salvation. Behind was ruin. She chose ruin. The valley shook with fire, the mountains echoed with thunder, and the smoke of the cities climbed like a furnace. But in the plain, a single figure stood still, frozen forever between past and future, between mercy and judgment. Lot pressed on with his daughters. He did not speak of it then. He did not cry out. His grief was buried beneath survival. But he knew, and they knew, that one look had cost them everything. And the world has never forgotten. The eastern sky cracked with dawn. Pale light touched the hills, but it was not the light of peace. It was the light before fire. Lot and his daughters had just crossed into Zoar. The angels had spoken, "Hurry, I can do nothing until you arrive." Now, with the righteous secured, heaven unleashed its fury. It began with a silence so deep that even the birds stilled. Then the silence tore apart. From the heavens rained fire, not lightning, not storm, but burning sulphur, blazing stone, rivers of flame hurled down as though the very sky were vomiting judgment. The roar thundered through the valley, shaking the earth beneath every foot, rattling walls until they split. Sodom's streets, once filled with music, exploded in chaos. Roofs caught fire and collapsed. Courtyards where children had played became pools of flame. Merchants who had boasted of their wealth cried out as their treasures melted into ash. Dancers who had laughed at righteousness fell into the very fire they mocked. The young men who had laughed at Lot the night before, their cups still half full, their mouths still curved in derision, were swept away in the blaze. Their laughter turned to screams, but the fire was quicker than their cries. The houses of the rich and the huts of the poor burned alike. No wall was high enough, no door strong enough, no hand quick enough. Judgment fell without discrimination. The proud and the lowly, the rulers and the beggars, every heart that had turned from righteousness was consumed together. The lush orchards that once promised endless harvests shriveled in seconds. The vineyards boiled into smoke, the streams hissed and vanished, their waters vaporized by the heat of sulphur. Animals fled, then fell, then disappeared in the blaze. The valley that had been called like Eden became a furnace, a crucible of fire and ash. Men and women fled through the streets, but every path turned into flame. Those who ran east found fire, those who ran west found collapse. The walls themselves split and tumbled, burying lives beneath rubble. The very earth opened its mouth and sulphur poured into its cracks. And above it all the sky burned. The smoke rose like a vast pillar, black and thick, blotting out the sun. Morning turned to night, then to something worse than night, a darkness alive with fire, a sky scarred by wrath. Lot and his daughters huddled in Zoar. They dared not lift their eyes, but they did not need to. The ground shook beneath them. The air burned their lungs. Ash rained like snow upon the roofs. Through the roar they heard the voices of a city dying, the endless wails, the shouts cut short, the chorus of despair swallowed by flame, and far away Abraham rose early. He went to the place where he had once stood before the Lord, where he had pleaded for 50, for 40, for 30, for 20, for 10. He lifted his eyes toward the valley. What he saw broke his heart. The land that had shimmered like Eden was gone. In its place rose smoke, thick and endless, climbing to the heavens like the smoke of a furnace. The valley had become a scar upon the earth, a wound so deep it would never be healed. The homes, the markets, the laughter, the pride, all vanished. Abraham's silence was heavy. He had asked for mercy. Mercy had been offered, but 10 righteous had not been found. and the judge of all the earth had done what was just. The fire did not stop until every corner of Sodom and Gomorrah lay in ruin. Their neighboring cities, Admah, Zeboim, were swept away with them. The whole plain that had once promised life was scorched into death. Where rivers had flowed, now steam rose. Where trees had stood, now pillars of ash remained. And in the plain, one figure remained, a silent witness. Lot's wife crystallized in salt, standing forever between what was and what might have been. A monument to disobedience, a reminder for every generation. Do not look back. The smoke carried for miles. Shepherds on distant ridges saw it and trembled. Traders on desert roads turned their caravans aside. No man who looked on that valley doubted what had happened. God had risen in judgment, and no city, however proud, could stand against him. The land was left desolate. No crops grew, no bird flew over it, no man pitched his tent there. It became a wasteland, a graveyard beneath the open sky, a warning written in fire. From that day forward, the name Sodom and Gomorrah carried more than memory. They became a proverb, a curse, a shadow. To speak their names was to invoke destruction, to warn of arrogance and sin, to whisper of fire, and still the smoke rose. Lot, holding his daughters close, whispered no words. His grief was too heavy, his sorrow too deep. He thought of his wife, frozen in the plain. He thought of his sons-in-law buried in ash. He thought of a city that had once laughed with pride and now lay silent forever. The fire from heaven had fallen, the valley was no more, and the world had been given a warning it would never forget. Morning had come, but it was no ordinary dawn. Abraham rose early. As was his custom, he stepped out from his tent beneath the oaks of Mamre. The air still cool, the hills washed in soft light. He had not slept deeply that night. His prayers had lingered long in his heart, words spoken and respoken, pleas that clung to his spirit even as the stars faded. He walked to the ridge, the same place where days earlier he had stood before the Lord, daring to plead for mercy. There he had asked, "If 50 righteous are found, will you spare the city? If 45, if 40, if 30, if 20, if 10? And each time the Lord had answered, "Yes, for their sake I will spare it." Abraham had rested on those words. 10, surely 10 righteous souls could be found among thousands. Surely Lot, his nephew, his family, their servants, surely they were not alone. Surely 10 candles still burned in the darkness. But now he lifted his eyes, and what he saw chilled his bones. The valley that once shimmered with life was a sea of smoke. It rose in thick, endless pillars, black and red curling upward into the sky. It looked like the mouth of a furnace yawning wide, spewing fire into the heavens. The green fields were gone, the rivers boiled away, the orchards stripped, the cities erased. Nothing remained but desolation. The land looked wounded, scarred beyond healing. Where beauty had dazzled, ruin now reigned. Where men had boasted, silence screamed. Abraham stood still. He did not shout. He did not weep aloud. His grief was too deep for sound. He thought of Lot, his brother's son, the boy he had watched grow, the man he had seen choose the valley long ago. Had he survived? Had mercy reached him? Abraham did not know. All he saw was fire's aftermath. All he felt was the weight of judgment. The smoke carried voices, though faint, not the voices of the living, but echoes of the cries that had risen before the fire fell. He remembered the words of the Lord. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great. Their sin is very grave. Abraham had not heard those cries, but God had. Now the earth bore witness to their justice. Abraham bowed his head. The judge of all the earth had done what was just. He had listened to intercession. He had offered mercy, but mercy cannot be forced on hearts that mock it. 10 righteous had not been found. The silence pressed down on Abraham, heavier than stone. He thought of his conversation with God, how bold he had been to ask again and again, how patient the Lord had been to answer. Yet in the end his plea could not save a city that refused to be saved. And still, beneath the smoke, Abraham believed in God's mercy. For he knew the Lord had not forgotten Lot. He could not yet see the truth, but mercy had reached that house, had seized those hands, had dragged them from the fire. Abraham's prayer had not been wasted. It had been answered in the salvation of the few, even if the many perished. The wind shifted, carrying the acrid stench of sulphur up the ridge. Abraham turned his face aside, his eyes blurred. He thought of the valley's pride, its markets, its music, its laughter, all gone, and he thought of the God who had waited, who had given time, who had listened to pleas. But time had run out, and justice had spoken. This moment, Abraham standing on the ridge, looking down at the smoke of judgment, is one of the most solemn in Scripture. It is not triumph, it is not vengeance, it is sorrow, it is a warning. For the same Abraham who had once stood before the Lord and pleaded for mercy, now stood before the valley and witnessed what happens when sin fills its measure. The fire was not random, it was not blind, it was the verdict of heaven. And Abraham, though grieved, could not deny it was just. He stood long on that ridge, his cloak heavy with ash, carried on the wind. He said no words, for there were none to say. His silence was prayer, his sorrow intercession turned to mourning. The valley smoked and Abraham watched. Generations later, prophets would point to this image, Abraham looking at the ruins of Sodom, as the eternal warning. They would say, "As Sodom and Gomorrah were overthrown, so shall it be for every nation that turns from righteousness." And Jesus would remind his disciples, "On the day when the Son of Man is revealed, it will be like the days of Lot. People will be eating and drinking, buying and selling, planting and building." But on the day Lot left Sodom, fire and sulphur rained down from heaven and destroyed them all. Abraham saw the first pillar of smoke. Jesus spoke of the last. Between them stretches the warning for every age. On the ridge, the patriarch stood in silence. He had pleaded for mercy. Mercy had been shown. He had asked for 10. There had not been 10. But God had remembered Abraham's prayer. Lot and his daughters lived, though Abraham did not yet know it. The covenant between God and Abraham endured, unbroken by the fire that consumed the plain. Still the sight remained burned into his memory. Smoke rising like a furnace, judgment falling like rain, beauty erased in a single dawn. Abraham turned at last and walked back toward his tent. Behind him the valley smouldered. Ahead of him stretched the land of promise. Between them lay the eternal truth. The judge of all the earth does what is just, and the smoke of Sodom would rise in human memory forever. The valley was gone, its walls had fallen, its streets erased, its laughter silenced. Smoke still curled upward like the breath of a furnace, visible for miles, a dark scar against the horizon. What had once been called paradise was now wasteland, uninhabitable, cursed. But Lot lived. He and his 2 daughters had reached Zoar, the little city spared for mercy's sake. At first, Lot tried to rest there. Zoar had been granted as a refuge, a circle of safety carved out in the midst of judgment. But fear clung to him like a shadow. Each breath carried the taste of sulphur. Each morning he looked at the smoke rising from the plain and wondered, would Zoar stand or would fire fall again? So Lot left even that small mercy and climbed into the hills. With his daughters he found a cave, hollow and cold, a place of survival but not of comfort. The man who had once chosen the lushest valley now lived in stone and silence. He had lost his wife, he had lost his sons-in-law, he had lost his wealth, his city, his name. What remained was breath and 2 daughters who clung to him, and there, in the darkness of that cave, another shadow fell. The daughters looked at the desolation around them and believed the world was ended. They thought no man remained alive on the earth, no future lay ahead. Desperation drove them to a desperate plan. They gave their father wine, and while he was unaware, they lay with him, each in turn. From those nights were born 2 sons. The eldest child was Moab, father of the Moabites. The youngest son was Ben-Ammi, father of the Ammonites. 2 nations rose from the ashes of Sodom, nations that would one day become enemies of Israel, nations whose very existence bore the mark of that cave. Even in survival, Sodom's legacy lingered. From then on, Sodom and Gomorrah were remembered not only as cities destroyed, but as warnings. The prophets spoke of them often. Isaiah declared, "Babylon, the jewel of kingdoms, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah, when God overthrew them." Jeremiah thundered, "No man shall dwell there, no son of man shall sojourn in it, as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah." Ezekiel revealed the deeper root: pride, excess of food, prosperous ease, neglect of the poor, arrogance, and abominations before God. Their names became shorthand for judgment. To say, like Sodom, was to speak of wickedness beyond remedy, pride beyond repentance. They became symbols etched into memory, invoked whenever the prophets warned that arrogance leads to ruin. And centuries later, their shadow fell again. Jesus himself spoke of them. If the mighty works done in you had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until this day, he said to the cities that rejected him. And to his disciples he warned, on the day Lot went out from Sodom, fire and sulfur rained from heaven and destroyed them all. So will it be on the day when the Son of Man is revealed. The apostles echoed the same truth. Peter wrote, God condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly. Jude said, they serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. Even the book of Revelation, in its visions of the end, names a great city spiritually called Sodom, a sign that the arrogance of those ancient streets still repeats wherever men mock righteousness and embrace corruption. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah did not end in the fire. It lives as a mirror. It asks every generation, where do you stand? Do you laugh like Lot's sons-in-law, blind to the warnings? Do you hesitate like Lot, lingering at the edge of destruction until mercy drags you out? Do you look back like Lot's wife, longing for what God has condemned? Or do you press forward, clinging to mercy, refusing to turn your eyes to the fire? Sodom's downfall was not sudden. It was built choice by choice, day by day, until the cries of the oppressed reached heaven. Its destruction was swift, but its warning is eternal. The valley that once looked like Eden now speaks like a prophet. God is not mocked. Judgment comes, and mercy is still offered to those who will flee while there is time. For Abraham's question still hangs in the air, shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? The answer, written in flame and smoke, is yes. Always yes. He is just. He is merciful. He spares for the sake of the righteous. He rescues those who will take his hand, but he will not leave sin unpunished. Lot's wife looked back. Sodom's people laughed, but Abraham interceded. Lot escaped. God remembered mercy, and the story remains for us, not to entertain, not to decorate, but to warn, to awaken, to call. Do not look back, do not linger, do not laugh when judgment is spoken, for the fire that fell once will fall again. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is not just a record of the past, it is a mirror held up to the present, to my generation, to yours, to every heart. and its voice whispers through time, remember Lot's wife. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is not just about the past. It's a mirror for us today, a reminder to keep moving forward, to hold on to mercy, and not to look back. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story touched you, I'd love for you to join me here for more. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel, and we'll keep walking through these powerful stories together.